The initiation of Sarah isn't remembered for loud shocks or graphic terror. Instead, it unsettles in a quieter way. It asks what happens when power hides behind tradition, when cruelty is justified as belonging, and when humiliation is reframed as a necessary step toward acceptance. What begins as a story about a shy outsider quickly becomes a study of how closed systems protect themselves no matter who gets hurt along the way. Released in the late 1970s, the film arrived at a moment when American culture was re-examining institutions that had long been treated as untouchable. Sororities, fraternities, and elite social circles were still presented as aspirational spaces, yet their internal dynamics were rarely questioned on screen. This film dared to do exactly that. It took a familiar environment and introduced a dangerous imbalance, supernatural power placed in the hands of someone who had spent her life being ignored. But the real discomfort doesn't come from the psychic abilities at the center of the story. It comes from watching how quickly cruelty becomes normalized when it's endorsed by the group. The initiations, the tests, the unspoken rules. Each one reveals a truth that feels uncomfortably modern. Systems built on hierarchy rarely collapse from the outside, they rot from within. What makes this film linger is its refusal to offer simple moral comfort. Revenge doesn't feel triumphant, justice doesn't feel clean, and empowerment comes at a cost that the story never fully resolves. Instead, it leaves us with a question that's harder to dismiss than any scare when someone finally gains power in an unjust system. Do they change the rules, or do they become part of the machinery? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about. The initiation of Sarah, a television film that quietly laid the groundwork for an entire subgenre while asking a question many later films were too afraid to face. 1. The story behind the initiation of Sarah did not begin as a television-friendly morality tale. It originated from a novel that leaned far more aggressively into psychological cruelty and moral ambiguity elements that network television in the late 1970s was deeply uncomfortable embracing in full. When the project was adapted for broadcast, many of the harsher implications were softened, not removed, but strategically reframed. What survived was not the explicit brutality, but something arguably more unsettling: the quiet normalization of humiliation. This adaptation choice shaped the film's tone in a crucial way. Instead of positioning horror as an external threat, the story places it inside an accepted social structure. The sorority is never presented as a den of villains at first glance. It is orderly, respected, and outwardly nurturing. That surface respectability was exactly what made it acceptable for television, and exactly what allowed the darker elements to slip past censors. Cruelty, when dressed as tradition, was considered less dangerous than overt violence. What many viewers didn't realize at the time was that this restraint forced the film to become more precise. Without gore or sensational shocks, the narrative relies on implication, lingering looks, controlled dialogue, and moments of silence, where the audience is invited to recognize something wrong before the characters do. The result is a version of horror that feels closer to real social experiences than fantasy. Ironically, the limitations imposed by television may have strengthened the film's legacy. By removing the obvious horrors, the story highlights something harder: to confront the idea that systems can harm people without ever appearing monstrous. And that subtlety is exactly why the film continues to resonate long after its original broadcast. Do you think the film's impact would have been weaker or stronger if it had been allowed to show its cruelty openly? 2. The sorority portrayed in the film was not an exaggerated invention, but a reflection of real-world practices that were rarely discussed publicly at the time. During the 1960s and 1970s, initiation rituals across American campuses often blurred the line between bonding and degradation. While extreme cases were dismissed as isolated incidents, many milder forms of humiliation were quietly accepted as character-building exercises. What makes the film unsettling is how accurately it captures that atmosphere of complicity. No single character needs to be overtly sadistic for harm to occur. Instead, cruelty becomes procedural. Each participant plays a small role, reassured by the belief that tradition absolves responsibility. The film never frames these actions as shocking within the story's world, only uncomfortable to the viewer. This realism was intentional. The filmmakers reportedly consulted contemporary accounts of campus life, shaping scenes to feel routine rather than exceptional. That decision explains why the sorority members rarely see themselves as villains. They are not breaking rules. They are enforcing them. And that distinction matters. It transforms the horror from personal malice into institutional behavior. What lingers is the recognition that exclusion does not require hatred, only structure. The initiations function less as tests of worth, and more as filters deciding who is allowed access to power and who remains invisible. By grounding its horror in this social truth, the film exposes a mechanism that extends far beyond its fictional setting. Is the sorority frightening because of what it does, or because of how easily it justifies doing it? 3. The supernatural abilities at the center of the film are often mistaken for its main source of power, but they are deliberately treated as secondary. Psychic phenomena are not portrayed as miraculous gifts. They are unstable, reactive, and deeply tied to emotional trauma. The story makes it clear that these abilities do not emerge from strength, but from isolation. Rather than empowering the protagonist immediately, the film frames her powers as a liability. They surface at moments of distress, reinforcing the idea that power gained under pressure rarely arrives, clean or controlled. This approach separates the film from later entries in the genre, where supernatural abilities often function as straightforward tools of revenge or liberation. What's more unsettling is how the narrative contrasts supernatural power with social power. The sorority leaders wield influence without any paranormal aid, yet their control is more consistent and more socially protected. In comparison, psychic ability is unpredictable and dangerous precisely because it exists outside accepted systems. By placing these two forms of power side by side, the film raises an uncomfortable question: which is more destructive, the ability to move objects with the mind or the ability to dictate belonging? The answer is never stated outright, but the consequences suggest that invisible authority can be far more damaging than any supernatural force. In that sense, the psychic element becomes symbolic rather than sensational. It represents what happens when suppressed voices finally push back, messy, frightening, and impossible to fully contain. Does the film suggest that power itself is the problem, or the systems that decide who deserves it? 4. The character of Sarah was written as an outsider long before her abilities ever come into play. And that choice is what gives the story its emotional weight. She is not isolated because she is strange or threatening, but because she fails to meet an unspoken standard of desirability, confidence, and social polish. The film quietly suggests that exclusion often precedes any real difference it creates it. Unlike many horror protagonists of the era, Sarah isn't immediately framed as sympathetic through innocence or virtue. Instead, she is hesitant, withdrawn, and observant. She watches more than she speaks. This perspective places the audience inside the experience of someone navigating a system that was never designed for her. The horror doesn't erupt suddenly. It accumulates through small, repeated signals that she does not belong. What's unsettling is how little resistance this exclusion meets. Other characters recognize the imbalance, but few challenge it. The film presents indifference as a form of complicity, reinforcing the idea that harm often survives not because people agree with it, but because they find it easier to look away. Sarah's eventual transformation, then, is not a sudden turn toward darkness. It is a response to sustained erasure. By grounding her arc in social reality rather than spectacle, the film makes her power feel less like destiny and more like consequence. She becomes dangerous not because she seeks control, but because control was never offered to her in any acceptable form. Is Sarah frightening because of what she can do, or because of what was done to her before she ever fought back? 5. The initiation rituals depicted in the film were controversial not for their intensity, but for how familiar they felt. Rather than relying on extreme humiliation, the film shows acts that are deliberately mundane, commands disguised as jokes, obedience framed as tradition, and discomfort dismissed as weakness. These moments pass quickly on screen, but their cumulative effect is deeply unsettling. What makes these scenes effective is their tone. They are not shot as moments of obvious cruelty. There is laughter, there is encouragement, and there is always the implication that enduring this treatment is a privilege. The film understands that humiliation is most effective when it doesn't look like punishment, when it feels voluntary. This approach mirrors real-world dynamics more closely than exaggerated hazing ever could. By avoiding spectacle, the film exposes a psychological mechanism. People tolerate harm more easily when it is shared, ritualized, and normalized. No one wants to be the first to say that something is wrong, especially when everyone else insists it's harmless. The true violence of these scenes lies in their aftermath. They teach participants to internalize blame, to reinterpret discomfort as personal failure rather than systemic abuse. In doing so, the rituals prepare members not just to endure harm, but to perpetuate it. Does the film imply that initiation is about proving strength or about learning silence? 6. As a made-for-television film, the story was forced to operate under strict broadcast standards. Yet it consistently tests the limits of what those standards allowed. Instead of confronting censorship directly, the filmmakers leaned into suggestion, allowing implication to carry what explicit imagery could not. This strategy created a different kind of tension, one rooted in anticipation rather than shock. Scenes often end a beat too early. Reactions are shown instead of actions. Consequences are felt more than displayed. These choices were not merely technical compromises. They shaped the film's identity. Viewers were left to fill in the gaps themselves, which often resulted in interpretations more disturbing than anything shown outright. This restraint also shifted responsibility onto the audience. By refusing to spell everything out, the film asks viewers to recognize familiar patterns in unfamiliar contexts. It doesn't tell you that something is wrong, it waits for you to realize it. That realization is quieter, but harder to dismiss. In retrospect, this limitation may be one of the film's greatest strengths. It transforms censorship into a narrative tool, reinforcing the idea that the most dangerous systems are rarely obvious. They operate politely, efficiently, and without spectacle. Is subtlety more unsettling than explicit horror? Or does it simply demand more from the viewer? 7. One of the film's most overlooked achievements is how it portrays violence without relying on physical impact. Harm in the story is rarely loud or explosive. Instead, it is procedural, embedded in routines, expectations, and polite authority. The damage happens gradually through compliance rather than force, which makes it harder to identify and even harder to resist. This approach reflects a deeper understanding of how power operates in closed environments. No one needs to shout or threaten. The rules do the work on their own. Characters participate not because they are cruel, but because the system rewards obedience and punishes dissent in subtle ways. The film frames this dynamic with uncomfortable clarity, suggesting that the most effective forms of control rarely announce themselves as such. What's unsettling is how familiar this structure feels. The story doesn't ask the audience to imagine an extreme scenario. It asks them to recognize patterns they may have already experienced. Meetings, initiations, hierarchies. None of these are inherently dangerous, yet within the film they become tools for quiet coercion. By stripping violence of spectacle, the film reframes it as something that can exist comfortably inside social order. That idea lingers longer than any single shocking scene, because it implies that harm doesn't need chaos to survive, it only needs routine. Does the absence of visible violence make the film less frightening or more honest? 8. Although the film is often discussed alongside other supernatural horror stories of its era, its relationship to the genre is unusually restrained. Rather than using paranormal elements to drive the plot forward, the film treats them as symptoms, responses to pressure, rather than sources of control. Power emerges not from desire, but from distress. This distinction separates the story from later films that frame supernatural ability as empowerment fantasy. Here, the powers are unstable, unpredictable, and deeply personal. They don't offer clarity or liberation. They introduce risk. Every manifestation carries consequences, reinforcing the idea that power gained through suffering rarely arrives cleanly. What's more revealing is how the narrative contrasts these abilities with institutional authority. The sorority leaders wield influence effortlessly, supported by tradition and group consensus. Their power is calm, socially validated, and rarely questioned. In comparison, supernatural ability is chaotic, precisely because it lacks legitimacy. By placing these two forces side by side, the film quietly critiques which forms of power society accepts and which it fears. Psychic phenomena are treated as dangerous anomalies, while social domination is normalized, even celebrated. The imbalance feels intentional, forcing the audience to reconsider where real danger actually lies. Is the supernatural element meant to frighten us, or to expose what we've already accepted as normal? 9. The film's connection to later entries in the genre is often discussed, but its influence is more structural than stylistic. It didn't establish visual tropes so much as narrative patterns: the isolated outsider, the closed group, and the moral ambiguity of retaliation. These elements would later be amplified, simplified, or sensationalized, but rarely questioned. What sets this film apart is its refusal to fully endorse revenge. While later stories often frame retaliation as cathartic, this narrative keeps its distance. Power shifts, but discomfort remains. There is no moment of complete release, no clean victory that resolves the underlying imbalance. The system may be disrupted, but it is never truly dismantled. This restraint gives the story an aftertaste that many imitators lack. Instead of offering emotional closure, it leaves the audience unsettled, aware that replacing one authority figure with another does not guarantee justice. In doing so, the film suggests that cycles of power are easier to repeat than to break. That unresolved tension may be why the film feels less celebrated than its successors and why it remains quietly influential. It asks harder questions, then refuses to answer them. Do later films improve on this formula, or do they avoid its most uncomfortable implications? 10. One reason the initiation of Sarah is often underestimated is its pacing. The film unfolds deliberately, almost cautiously, resisting the temptation to rush towards spectacle. For modern audiences, conditioned by faster editing and constant escalation, this restraint can feel uneventful. But that slow rhythm is doing important work beneath the surface. The film allows discomfort to breathe. Awkward silences linger. Social tensions are not resolved quickly. Scenes often end without emotional release, leaving unease to accumulate rather than dissipate. This pacing mirrors the experience of navigating a hostile social environment, where harm is rarely a single dramatic event, but a series of small, persistent pressures. What's striking is how little actually needs to happen for the atmosphere to become oppressive. A look held too long, a rule stated casually, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. These moments would lose their power if rushed. By slowing down, the film forces the viewer to sit with them, to recognize patterns instead of isolated incidents. In hindsight, this deliberate pace may be why the film stays with viewers who give it time. It doesn't shock you into fear. It eases you into recognition. Does the film feel slow because nothing is happening, or because too much is happening quietly? The antagonists in the film are never presented as obvious monsters, and that choice complicates the viewer's moral response. The leaders of the sorority are composed, articulate, and outwardly responsible. They believe in the structure they maintain, and that belief shields them from self-doubt. The film avoids portraying them as sadists, which would make them easier to dismiss. Instead, they function as administrators of harm. Their authority comes not from personal cruelty, but from confidence in the system itself. They enforce rules because the rules exist and because enforcing them reinforces their own legitimacy. This circular logic is never questioned within their world, and that is precisely the problem. What makes this portrayal unsettling is how recognizable it is. The film suggests that many forms of abuse are carried out by people who see themselves as reasonable. They are not driven by hatred, but by duty. And duty, when detached from empathy, can be far more damaging than open hostility. By refusing to simplify its antagonists, the film denies the audience an easy target for blame. The real threat becomes the structure that protects them. Are these characters villains, or just faithful servants of a flawed system? 12. The film's ending is often remembered as ambiguous, but that ambiguity is intentional rather than unresolved. Instead of offering a clear moral resolution, the narrative stops at a moment of uneasy balance. Power has shifted, yet nothing feels healed. The silence that follows is not peace. It is uncertainty. This choice distinguishes the film from many later genre entries that favor closure. There is no triumphant release, no assurance that the cycle of harm has been broken. The audience is left to wonder what happens next, not just to the characters, but to the system that produced them. What lingers is the implication that injustice rarely ends cleanly. Removing one source of harm does not automatically dismantle the conditions that allowed it to thrive. The film resists the fantasy that suffering can be neatly resolved through retaliation or revelation. That unresolved tension may be why the ending divides viewers. Some find it unsatisfying, others recognize it as honest. It refuses to comfort, and in doing so it preserves the film's central question long after the credits roll. Does ambiguity weaken the film's message or make it impossible to ignore? 13. The film's moral framework is deliberately unstable, and that instability is one of its most challenging qualities. At no point does the narrative offer a clear ethical anchor, a character or perspective that definitively tells the audience how to feel. Instead, it presents actions and consequences, then steps back. The viewer is left to navigate the discomfort on their own. This approach was unusual for television at the time, which typically favored clear lessons and reassuring conclusions. Here, morality is conditional. Sympathy shifts depending on context. Moments that initially feel justified later appear troubling when viewed from another angle. The film quietly suggests that power complicates ethics rather than clarifying them. What makes this especially unsettling is how quickly good intentions erode once control is within reach. The story implies that righteousness is fragile, easily reshaped by circumstance. No one is immune, not even those who begin as victims. By refusing to sanctify any position, the film challenges the audience to confront their own assumptions about fairness and revenge. Is the film asking us to judge its characters, or to recognize how easily judgment itself can be compromised? 14. Despite its modest production scale, the film exerted a disproportionate influence on what would later become known as sorority horror. While many subsequent entries borrowed surface elements, group dynamics, rituals, exclusion, few retained the original's psychological restraint. The genre evolved towards spectacle, but its foundation was already laid. What later films often simplified, this one left unresolved. The focus was not on punishment, but on exposure. By showing how power circulates within a closed group, the film provided a template that others would follow, even if they softened its implications. In many ways, its influence is easier to see in structure than in style. This legacy is rarely acknowledged directly, perhaps because it is uncomfortable. Acknowledging it means recognizing that some of the genre's most familiar tropes originated not in fantasy, but in social critique. The film doesn't just scare, it accuses. Does the genre honor its roots, or dilute them to make the horror more palatable? 15. One reason the film continues to be rediscovered, rather than continuously celebrated, is its resistance to nostalgia. It does not invite affectionate remembrance of its era. Instead, it quietly critiques the social norms that surrounded it. There is no romanticism in its portrayal of tradition, hierarchy, or belonging. As time passes, this refusal becomes more noticeable. What once felt like a commentary on a specific moment now reads as a broader examination of institutional behavior. The film ages not because it reflects the past, but because it anticipates recurring patterns. Each generation finds new relevance in its questions, even if the setting feels distant. That timelessness may be why the film never fully settles into cult status. It demands engagement rather than admiration. It asks viewers to think, not just remember. Is the film overlooked because it's dated, or because it remains uncomfortably current? 16. The way the film handles emotional escalation is unusually restrained for its genre. Rather than building toward a single explosive breaking point, tension accumulates through repetition. Small humiliations recur. Authority goes unchallenged. Discomfort is absorbed rather than confronted. This repetition creates a sense of inevitability, as if the outcome is less a twist than a consequence. What's striking is how little narrative emphasis is placed on choice. Characters rarely pause to reflect on alternatives. Actions are taken because they are expected, not because they are desired. The film frames this lack of reflection as the true danger. When behavior becomes automatic, accountability quietly disappears. By the time the story reaches its most intense moments, the audience understands that the damage was done long before any visible retaliation occurred. The escalation feels earned, not sudden. It mirrors real-world systems, where harm is rarely the result of one decision, but of many small ones left unexamined. Does the film suggest that catastrophe comes from intent or from habit? 17. Memory plays a subtle role in how the film operates, both within the story and in how audiences recall it. Many viewers remember isolated moments, an initiation, a confrontation, a display of power without recalling how quietly those moments were prepared. The film relies on this effect, allowing its most unsettling ideas to settle gradually, rather than announce themselves. This structure makes the film easy to underestimate on first viewing. Without dramatic signposts, its themes can feel understated. But on revisiting, the story patterns emerge. The same behaviors repeat. The same justifications are reused. The repetition becomes impossible to ignore. In this way, the film rewards attention rather than excitement. It assumes an audience willing to reflect after the fact, to reconsider scenes that initially felt unremarkable. That assumption may explain why its reputation grows slowly, through rediscovery rather than hype. Is the film forgettable on first viewing, or deliberately designed to haunt reflection rather than memory? 18. Perhaps the most unsettling implication of the film is that no external force ever truly threatens the system it portrays. There is no outside authority stepping in, no moral reckoning imposed from beyond the group. Everything that happens unfolds entirely within the closed world of the sorority and its surrounding environment. This isolation is not accidental. By removing external intervention, the film suggests that systems like this persist because they are self-sustaining. They correct deviations internally. They absorb disruption. Even moments of apparent rebellion are folded back into the structure rather than allowed to dismantle it. The absence of rescue reframes the story's conflict. Survival does not come from escape, but from adaptation. That realization is deeply uncomfortable because it implies that injustice often endures not because it is unstoppable, but because it is normalized. Does the film imply that change must come from within, or that systems are designed to survive it? 19. What ultimately makes the initiation of Sarah endure is not its plot mechanics, but the discomfort it refuses to resolve. By the final stretch, the audience has seen how power circulates, how humiliation becomes routine, and how authority protects itself through silence. Yet the film never offers the relief of believing that awareness alone is enough to undo damage. Instead, it suggests something far more troubling. Systems rarely collapse because they are exposed. They collapse only when participation stops, and participation is often the hardest thing to give up. Characters remain inside the structure not because they are forced to stay, but because leaving would mean surrendering identity, safety, and belonging all at once. This implication reframes the film's central conflict. The true struggle is not between individuals, but between comfort and conscience. By highlighting how much people are willing to tolerate to remain included, the film quietly indicts the audience as well. Recognition does not equal resistance. Is the film asking us to sympathize with its characters or to question how often we accept similar systems in our own lives? 20. By the time the story reaches its conclusion, the most unsettling realization is how ordinary everything feels. There is no dramatic collapse, no cleansing reckoning. Life simply continues altered, but intact. The institution survives. The rituals remain recognizable. The damage becomes part of the past, absorbed into memory rather than addressed. This ending reframes the entire film as a warning, rather than a tale of transformation. It suggests that injustice does not always announce itself with catastrophe. More often, it settles quietly into routine waiting to be repeated. The horror lies not in what happens once, but in what becomes acceptable. In that sense, the film's final message is less about fear than about vigilance. It implies that systems persist because people grow accustomed to them, and that change requires more than power-shifting hands. It requires refusal. Does the film leave us unsettled because it ends without justice, or because it feels honest about how rarely justice arrives? One of the most quietly disturbing aspects of the initiation of Sarah is how carefully it avoids labeling itself as a story about evil. There is no singular moment where the film declares, "This is wrong." Instead, it lets every troubling action exist inside a framework of justification, tradition, discipline, belonging, improvement. That restraint is not accidental. It mirrors how real systems protect themselves, not by denying harm, but by redefining it. What makes this especially unsettling is that the film never fully condemns its world from the outside. It doesn't introduce a moral authority to restore balance. There is no final voice of reason to explain the lesson. The absence of that voice forces the audience into an uncomfortable position. Interpretation becomes responsibility. You are asked to decide where the line was crossed and whether it ever truly mattered to those in power. This is why the film lingers longer than many of its successors. It doesn't provide catharsis, it provides recognition. Viewers are left not with fear of what they've seen, but with unease about what they've accepted before noticing it. In that sense, the film's true horror isn't supernatural at all. It's procedural, familiar, and disturbingly easy to overlook. If a system can harm people without ever seeing itself as cruel, does exposure actually change anything? Or does it simply become another part of the ritual? The initiation of Sarah doesn't end with certainty. It leaves behind questions about power, belonging, and the quiet ways harm is normalized when it's wrapped in tradition. Some viewers see the film as a story of empowerment. Others see it as a warning about what happens when authority changes hands without changing the system itself. Which moment in this film made you most uncomfortable, and why? Do you believe Sarah's power represents liberation or simply another form of control shaped by the same rules? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know which hidden or overlooked film we should dig into next.